The last thing Laura Mercer remembered before the water was the steering wheel pulling hard to the right. Not a drift. A snap. Like something underneath the car had simply decided to stop working. The guardrail came up fast and then there was nothing, just air and then impact and then cold. She opened her eyes to darkness. The kind that presses back. It took her a few seconds to understand the angle she was at, the heaviness in her ears, the way the seatbelt was cutting into her chest like it was trying to finish something the river had started. The car had gone nose first. Water was already past her knees, black and moving, finding every gap in the doors. She reached for the seatbelt release and pushed. Nothing. She pushed again. The buckle was jammed, warped from the impact, locked solid. Her hands weren't working right. The cold had gotten into them fast. She made herself stop and listen. That was the thing that saved her later, she would think. She stopped fighting the belt for just a moment and she listened. There were voices above her. On the bridge. Close enough that she could hear them through the water and the ringing in her skull. Two voices, talking in the unhurried way people talk when they are not afraid of being overheard. Derek's voice first. She knew it the way you know something you have heard every day for 20 years, not by recognizing it, just by knowing. He was saying this was the right spot. No cameras on this stretch. Nobody used this road after 4 in the afternoon. He had checked. Then Shannon's voice. Lighter. Asking how long. Derek said to give it a few more minutes. The current would handle the rest. Then he would call it in. Grieving husband couldn't reach her, drove out to look. He said the kids were 16. Old enough. He said her share of Mercer development alone was worth the math. Laura did not move. The water was at her waist. She had been married to Derek Mercer for 20 years. She had built a company with him, Mercer Development, 17 years old, now starting from a single construction contract and a shared checking account with not much in it. She had held his hand through his mother's death and through the birth of both their children in the same hospital years apart. And he was standing on a bridge in Williamson County waiting for the river to close over her roof, talking about her share of the company like it was a line item. The water hit her ribs. She reached across to the glove box. Derek kept a small tool kit in every vehicle he owned: folding knife, zip ties, electrical tape. A habit she had always thought was practical. Her fingers closed on the knife. She cut the belt in 4 strokes. She pulled one full breath from the shrinking air at the top of the cab and hit the door handle. The pressure had equalized just enough. The door gave. The river took her. She came up under the bridge behind a thick stand of reeds on the south bank. She did not make a sound. Above her, 2 figures stood at the railing looking down at the place where her car had gone in. They were not holding each other. They were just watching. Laura pulled herself onto the bank and moved into the dark without looking back. She didn't cry. She couldn't afford to yet. She found the shed by accident, nearly walking into the side of it in the dark. It sat at the far edge of a cut cornfield, the kind of structure nobody had bothered to tear down because nobody had bothered to think about it in years. The door hung open on one hinge. Inside smelled like rust and old motor oil and something that had been dry for a long time. She pulled the door as far closed as it would go and stood in the dark, shaking so hard her back teeth were clicking together. She got the wet clothes off. That was the first task, and she treated it like one, methodical, focused, because if she stopped being methodical she would fall apart and she could not afford that either. She found a folded tarp in the corner, stiff with age, and 2 lengths of burlap sacking hanging from a nail. She wrapped herself in both and sat down on the dirt floor with her back against the wall and waited for her body to stop fighting the cold. When the shaking finally slowed, she let herself think. Shannon Cole had been at Mercer Development for 3 years. Laura had hired her. Had liked her. Had complained to her over coffee in the break room about Derek's moods, his distance, the slow chill that had settled into their marriage over the past few years. Shannon had listened well. She had that quality, attentive, warm, never seeming to rush. Laura had mistaken it for friendship. Now she understood it for what it was. Research. The affair had been hiding inside something Laura had already decided to explain away. She had called it stress. She had called it the company growing too fast, Derek carrying too much. She had called it the particular way marriages go quiet after 20 years. She had not called it what it was because she had not wanted to. She ran the logic of going to the police. She had no phone, no ID, no wallet, everything was in her bag, which was at the bottom of the Duck River with the car. She had no witnesses. Derek was known in Williamson County in the way that men with money and long memories tend to be known. Shannon would account for his time without being asked twice. What Laura had was a story about voices she heard through a car window while she was half-conscious and no way to prove a single word of it. Then the other side of the ledger. They believed she was dead. That was the one thing she had that they didn't know she had. And there was something else. 3 months ago, without telling Derek, she had driven to a notary in a neighboring county and revised her will. She had cut him down to the legal minimum. Her share of Mercer Development went into trust for Brooke and Tyler, with Jim Calloway named executor and trustee until the twins turned 18. Derek thought he knew what that document said. He had been wrong about that since October. There is a specific kind of clarity that arrives when everything has been taken from you at once. Not calm exactly. More like the moment a fog burns off and you can see how far the road goes and what is standing in it. Laura felt that now, sitting in the dark in a stranger's shed wrapped in burlap a mile from the bridge where her husband had waited for her to drown. She could see the road. She could see what had to happen. She just needed a place to start. At first light through a gap in the shed wall, she saw a farmhouse across the field. She watched the house for 30 minutes before she moved toward it. One light on in the kitchen. A pickup truck with a cracked taillight parked close to the barn. No other vehicles. An older woman came out the back door around 7 in the morning, moving at the unhurried pace of someone running through a routine she had done 10,000 times, and headed toward the chicken coop with a metal bucket. She lived alone. Laura could tell by the stillness of the property the way a place settles into the shape of one person over time. She came out from the tree line and walked across the yard. The woman, Marge Hensley, she would say later, like it was information Laura would need, heard her coming and turned around without startling. She looked Laura over once, taking in the burlap, the bare feet, the state of her hair, and her expression didn't change much. Laura said she had been in a car accident. Said the car went into the water off a bridge and she barely got out. She said she needed dry clothes and she was sorry to come onto someone's property without asking. Marge set down the bucket and said to come inside. She gave Laura a pair of corduroys and a flannel shirt that had belonged to someone no longer around, and she put coffee on, and she said Laura needed to call the police. That a car accident was a serious thing. Laura said she couldn't do that. Marge looked at her over the rim of her own cup for a moment, then nodded once, like she was filing that away rather than arguing with it. She said she had a situation of her own years back with a man who thought he had more rights over her life than he did. She said it the way people say things they have made their peace with flat without asking for anything in return. She said her neighbor Earl drove into Columbia most mornings and could drop Laura at the bus station. They ate toast and didn't talk much. That evening, Marge turned on the local news out of Nashville and Laura was on it. The segment ran about 90 seconds. Laura Mercer, co-founder of Mercer Development Group, missing and presumed dead following a single vehicle accident on a rural bridge in Williamson County the previous evening. The car had not yet been recovered. Search and rescue had been suspended due to darkness and river conditions. Then the camera cut to Derek. He was standing near the bridge, coat collar up, and he looked like a man who had been crying recently and was trying to hold himself together for the camera. His voice broke once cleanly on the word hope. He said he was asking anyone who had seen anything to please come forward. He said she was his wife and the mother of his children. Laura watched him and felt something go very still inside her. He was good. She had lived with this man for 20 years and she had not known he was this good. Marge watched the screen, then watched Laura. Neither of them said anything for a while. In the morning, Earl's truck was idling in the driveway at 6:30 and Laura was in it. The bus from Columbia made 3 stops before Hohenwald and took the better part of 2 hours. Laura sat in the back with Ruth's address written on the inside of her wrist in ballpoint pen borrowed from the driver, watching the landscape shift from farmland to tree cover to the particular kind of quiet that settles over a county when there isn't much reason to pass through it. Lewis County had 1 stoplight and a Dollar General and a grain elevator that had been there since before anyone currently alive could remember. She walked the last mile and a half from the bus stop on a road without a shoulder, staying close to the tree line. Ruth Calvert's property sat back from a gravel drive screened by old cedar trees that had grown in close over the years. The house was small and white and had a covered porch with 2 chairs on it that looked like they hadn't been moved in some time. Laura was still 20 feet from the front steps when the door opened. Ruth stood in the doorway and looked at her. She was tall and spare with gray hair pinned back and eyes that had not softened much with age. She took in her niece the borrowed clothes, the state of her face, the fact that she was standing upright and breathing on a Tuesday afternoon when the television had said otherwise. She crossed herself, which Laura had never once seen her do. Then she said to come in out of the cold. Laura sat down at the kitchen table and told her everything. She had been arranging the story in her head for 2 days, and it came out in order without drama, the way you deliver bad numbers to a board when there is no point dressing them up. The bridge. The voices. Derek's voice. Shannon's voice. The utility knife. The shed. Marge. The news segment. She did not cry. She had been waiting to cry for 2 days and it still didn't come. Ruth listened without making a sound. When Laura finished, Ruth got up and came back with a mason jar half full of blackberry wine she had put up herself the previous summer, and she poured 2 glasses and set one in front of her niece. She said she had never trusted Derek Mercer. Said his eyes were wrong, something behind them that was always calculating, always measuring what a room was worth to him. She said she had tried to say as much to Laura's mother once years ago, and Laura's mother had said not to meddle. She hadn't brought it up again because there was no point saying things to a woman in love. Nobody in love ever heard that kind of warning. They just heard interference. Laura stared at the glass. She thought about her mother saying something like that and not repeating it. She thought about 17 years of building that company together and what those years had actually been underneath the version she had been living, not the whole marriage. Just the part where they had stood side by side over contracts and budgets and believed they were building something that belonged to both of them. Ruth told her to stay. Said this property was the last place on earth Derek would think to look because he had visited exactly twice in 20 years and made his feelings about rural Lewis County plain both times. No internet. No computer. A flip phone that lost signal if you stood in the wrong corner of the kitchen. Nobody was going to find her here. Laura nodded and picked up the glass. There is something specific about being believed by one person when the rest of the world has already written your name in the past tense. It doesn't fix anything, but it holds you together long enough to figure out what to do next. The problem was Brooke and Tyler. They were in that house with Derek, believing their mother was dead, and Laura had no way to reach them yet. Ruth had no internet, and the nearest public library with computers was back in Columbia. The bus ran on Tuesdays and Fridays. It was Wednesday evening. She had 2 days to wait. Friday morning, Ruth lent her a long denim skirt, a brown cardigan, and a headscarf she had owned since the 90s. She also handed over her state ID, and said to sign in under her name if anyone asked. Said the librarians in Columbia weren't the type to make things complicated. The bus picked up at the end of the road at 8:40 and made it into Columbia by just past 10. The Columbia Public Library was a single-story brick building 2 blocks off the main square. Laura pushed through the glass door and found 3 computer terminals along the back wall, the old kind with towers and separate monitors. A woman at the front desk glanced up and Laura set Ruth's ID on the counter and said she needed to use a computer. The woman typed something, slid the ID back and pointed her toward the terminals without another word. Laura sat down and opened a browser. The email account had been Brooke's idea back when she was 12 and briefly obsessed with spy novels. They had set it up together one Sunday afternoon, a free account under a made-up name, a password only the 2 of them knew. A code word for emergencies that Brooke had chosen herself and made Laura swear to memorize. They had used it for about 3 months, sending each other messages from opposite ends of the house, and then Brooke had moved on to something else and the account had sat untouched ever since. 4 years. Laura had never deleted it. She typed the password from memory and the inbox opened. She wrote the email, slowly reading each sentence twice before moving to the next. She told Brooke she was alive. She told her the crash was not an accident, and that she could not explain everything yet, but that she needed Brooke to trust her and to tell no one, not Tyler, not a friend, and especially not Derek. She said to reply only from a school computer or a friend's device, nothing connected to the house or to Derek's accounts. She said to include their code word in the reply so Laura would know it was really her. She hit send and started refreshing the page. After 90 minutes with no reply, she made herself stop and accept that Brooke might not check that account for days. She was about to close the browser when she decided to search her own name. The third result stopped her. It was a piece from a Nashville business news outlet, published 2 days earlier. Laura Mercer's revised will, filed 3 months before her death, had surfaced through the probate process, and it contained terms that had apparently surprised her husband. Her share of Mercer Development Group, roughly half the company, was placed in trust for her minor children, with Jim Calloway named executor and trustee until both twins reached 18. Derek had already retained attorneys to contest the document on grounds that Laura had been suffering from depression at the time of signing and lacked full capacity to execute a valid will. Jim Calloway, the article noted, had responded by moving to freeze all major company transactions pending resolution. Laura leaned back from the screen. 3 months ago, she had driven to a notary in a neighboring county on a Tuesday afternoon and told Derek she was having lunch with a client. She had revised that will because of small things, money moving between accounts in ways she hadn't authorized Derek's behavior on 2 phone calls she wasn't supposed to overhear. A feeling she couldn't name but couldn't shake. She hadn't known then that she was building a trap. She had thought she was being careful. Derek had found out about the will. Somehow he had found out, and he had decided the window for acting was closing, and he had picked a bridge on a rural highway on a Tuesday evening and done the math. On the bus back to Hohenwald, she sat with that knowledge settling into place around everything else she already knew. The affair. The timing. The bridge. It all ran in one direction. She understood now not just what Derek had done, but exactly why he had done it when he did. What she needed now was someone who could move through his world without him noticing. Ruth, she remembered, had mentioned someone once, an old friend from years back, someone who knew how to find things people tried to keep hidden. When Laura got back to the house that evening, she asked about her. Ruth made the call after dinner, standing on the back porch where the signal was marginally better. And Laura sat at the kitchen table and listened to one side of a conversation that lasted almost 40 minutes. She couldn't hear much, Ruth's voice low and steady, a few pauses, one short laugh that didn't sound like anything was funny. When Ruth came back inside, she set the phone on the table in front of Laura and said Carol wanted to talk to her directly. The voice on the other end was low and a little rough, the voice of someone who had spent a long career in rooms where people lied to her face and had stopped being surprised by it. Carol Briggs let Laura talk without interrupting. When Laura finished, there was a pause of about 4 seconds, and then Carol asked 3 questions: whether Laura had documentation of the will revision, whether she knew which notary office had handled it, and whether Derek had any connection to the county sheriff's department beyond the general kind that came with writing checks to the right people. Laura answered all 3. Carol said she would take it. She said she would name her price when it was done and that Laura would pay it, and that was the whole conversation about money. The following week moved slowly. Laura helped Ruth with the property, splitting wood and carrying water, doing the kind of physical work that was useful primarily because it kept her from sitting still. She walked the fields in the late afternoons. She slept poorly. She went back to Columbia on Tuesday to check the email account and found nothing, and then on Thursday a reply was there. The code word was right. It was Brooke. Her daughter's message was 3 paragraphs, and Laura read it 4 times. Brooke said she hadn't known what to think when the email arrived. She said Tyler hadn't come out of his room in days, wasn't eating much, wasn't talking. She said Derek moved through the house like someone performing grief for an audience that had already gone home. And she said that Shannon Cole had been there twice that week, once for dinner, once for longer. Carol called on Friday evening with her first full report. Derek and Shannon were planning to marry in 3 months once the formal mourning period had passed. Shannon had already moved several personal items into the house. Derek had contacted 2 potential buyers for his stake in Mercer Development, and Jim Calloway had blocked both transactions before they got past the preliminary stage. Derek was reportedly furious and had retained a second law firm to challenge the will on a faster timeline. Then Carol told her about Kayla Simmons. Shannon's cousin, 24 years old, had worked part-time at the notary's office for about 18 months. 3 months ago, right around the time Laura had gone in to revise the will, Kayla had passed the contents of that document to Shannon. For cash. Carol said the amount Kayla had been paid was modest enough to be insulting given what it had set in motion. Carol added that she had obtained recordings of several conversations between Derek and Shannon through lawful means. Tennessee required only one party in a conversation to consent to recording. And Carol had made sure that condition was met. Laura sat with that for a moment. The will revision. Shannon finding out within days. Derek's behavior shifting in the weeks that followed. The bridge. The betrayal hadn't started with the crash. It hadn't even started with the affair. There was a planned sequence, and it had been running longer than Laura had understood. Every time she thought she had found the beginning of it, the timeline kept moving back another step. She asked Carol what came next. Carol said she was still building the evidence and needed more time. She said the children were safe for now and that she had eyes on the house. 4 days later, Brooke sent an urgent message to the account. Derek had scheduled Tyler for admission to a private psychiatric facility in the Nashville metro. Acute depression with suicidal tendencies, according to the paperwork. The admission date was in 48 hours. Laura read Brooke's message twice, then called Carol from Ruth's flip phone without sitting down first. Carol already knew about the facility. She said it was a private adolescent behavioral health center off Harding Pike. The kind of place that charged $800 a day and had admitting physicians who understood what families sometimes needed a diagnosis to accomplish. She said if Tyler went in under those circumstances and Derek subsequently petitioned a family court for a finding of incapacity, Tyler's share of the Mercer Development Trust could fall under his father's guardianship pending the outcome. She said Derek wasn't moving to hurt his son. He was moving to make his son legally irrelevant. Laura hung up and told Ruth she was leaving in the morning. Ruth looked at her for a long moment and then said she was a fool. Then she went to the back bedroom and came out with a canvas bag and started putting things in it: a change of clothes, a $20 bill from the coffee can above the refrigerator, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. She said if Laura was going to do something reckless, she was at least going to do it fed. Carol called back while Laura was packing. She had a plan and she laid it out without asking whether Laura was ready to hear it. An anonymous call to the Williamson County Sheriff's Office, a witness claiming they saw a man crouched at the front end of Laura Mercer's vehicle in a parking area near the notary's office on the afternoon of the crash. The description would match Derek. That was enough to reopen the case as a potential criminal matter, which meant the department would be obligated to pull the car from the Duck River and run a forensic examination. Derek would be called in for a voluntary interview, standard procedure. Husband of the deceased, nothing alarming on its face. He would go. He wouldn't want to look like he had anything to avoid. That was the window. But Carol was clear about the timing. Working through proper channels, the department would need a few days to process the tip, assign it to an investigator, make the call to Derek, and schedule the interview. She said to expect 3 days, maybe 4. Laura should be in the city and ready to move the moment Brooke confirmed Derek had left the house. Carol texted her an address in a neighborhood off Charlotte Pike, a second-floor apartment in a building she used for sensitive cases. Key under the mat. Entry code in the text. Ruth's neighbor Herschel drove Laura as far as a truck stop off Interstate 65 without asking a single question, which Ruth had apparently arranged in advance. From there, Laura took a bus into Nashville and walked the last 6 blocks to the apartment. On the way, she stopped at a second-hand electronics shop on Charlotte Avenue and paid cash for a prepaid smartphone that the kid behind the counter activated without a second glance. She stopped at a Goodwill 2 blocks further and bought jeans, a gray sweatshirt, and a jacket that fit well enough. The apartment was on the second floor, small and clean and almost entirely empty. A couch, a folding table, 2 chairs. A kitchen with a coffee maker and 4 plates. It smelled like nobody had been there in a while, which was exactly the point. She sat down on the couch and messaged Brooke from the new phone. Told her she was in the city. Told her to stay calm, act normal, and be ready. Told her to text the moment Derek's car left the driveway. 3 days passed. Laura stayed close to the apartment, leaving only for food, keeping her head down in a city where her face had been on the evening news 3 weeks earlier. On the 3rd evening, Carol confirmed the interview had been scheduled for the following morning. Derek had agreed to come in voluntarily. Carol said he had no reason to refuse. As far as he knew, he was simply the grieving husband of a woman whose accident was being re-examined as routine follow-up. Brooke's text came at 8:14 the next morning. 3 words: he just left. Laura was already dressed. She requested a rideshare from the app Carol had loaded onto the prepaid phone and was outside in 4 minutes. She had the driver drop her 1 block east of the house and walked the rest of the way with her hands in her jacket pockets, moving at the pace of someone with somewhere ordinary to be. The gate code was the same. She had half expected Derek to change it, and he hadn't, which told her something about how certain he was that she was gone. She walked up the front path and rang the bell. Shannon opened the door. What crossed her face in the first second was not guilt and not anger. It was something more primitive than either of those things. The color left her completely. Her hand stayed on the door handle and her mouth opened, but nothing organized itself into words. She looked like a person whose understanding of how the world worked had just been revised without her consent. Laura said good morning. She said she was there for her children and that Shannon should step aside. She kept her voice level because there was nothing Shannon's reaction could give her that she needed right now. Shannon found her voice and started talking fast. Said this wasn't Laura's house anymore, said Derek would be back soon, said Laura had no idea what she was walking into. Laura told her about Kayla Simmons. She told her the car was coming up from the Duck River that morning and that the forensic team would find what Derek had done to the brake line. Because Derek was a structural engineer and precise men leave precise evidence. She told her Carol Briggs had recordings. She said all of this the way she would have delivered a financial summary to a board, clearly without inflection, watching Shannon's face move through several expressions in quick succession. Shannon moved to the bottom of the stairs and said she wasn't letting her up. Laura walked past her. Tyler's room was at the end of the hall. She knocked once and opened the door. He was sitting on the edge of his bed in the dim room, still in the clothes he had apparently slept in. And he looked up at her with the flat, unfocused expression of someone whose medication had taken the edges off everything, including his ability to process what he was seeing. He looked at her for a long moment and then said her name like it was a question, and then said she wasn't real, that the doctor had told him this would happen. That he had been seeing things that weren't there. She crossed the room and sat down next to him and took his face in both hands the way she had when he was small and needed to be made to focus. She made him look directly at her. She said his name. She said she was real, she was right here, she was not a side effect of anything. She said she was sorry it had taken her this long to get back to him. It took a few minutes. She could see him working against the sedation, working against 3 weeks of being told his mother was dead, working against whatever story Derek had built around that fact. And then something behind his eyes gave way, and he broke all at once, the way teenagers break, when they have been holding themselves together, past the point they should have, not quietly, but completely, his whole body shaking with it, his face against her shoulder. She held him and didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that mattered more than just being there. That moment gave back something she hadn't known Derek had taken from her. It also showed her without any ambiguity what 3 weeks of his father's management had cost her son. Brooke appeared in the doorway with a backpack over each shoulder. She had packed for both of them. She met her mother's eyes and nodded once, and Laura recognized in her daughter's face the particular steadiness of someone who has been waiting a long time to do exactly this. They were in the hallway when they heard the front door open. Derek came in fast and then stopped when he saw them at the top of the stairs. The stillness that crossed his face lasted only a moment before he reassembled himself, but Laura had been watching his face for 20 years and she caught it. He tried the measured approach first. Said there had clearly been some misunderstanding. Said he was relieved she was alive and that they needed to sit down and talk through what had happened. Laura came down the stairs and said there was nothing to talk through. He shifted to the legal angle then, and his voice got harder. He said she had no documents, no legal standing, that as far as any official record was concerned she did not exist. And that removing the children from the custody of their sole living legal guardian was a criminal act regardless of her intentions. Laura recognized the move for what it was. Derek had always been good at using the language of authority to fill a room, and this was no different. She didn't answer it. He said he would call the police and she would be detained before she reached the end of the street. Shannon came out of the kitchen holding a paring knife, gripping it in a way that made clear she had never held anything as a weapon before. Her hand was shaking. Laura looked at her and felt something that was almost pity. Tyler came down the last 3 steps and stopped in front of his father. He was still unsteady from the medication, visibly working to hold himself upright. He looked at Derek for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Move." 1 word. The first complete sentence he had produced in 3 weeks. Derek looked at his son. Something passed through his expression that Laura couldn't fully name. He stepped to the side. They walked to the front door. As Laura passed Derek, he leaned in close and said quietly that this wasn't finished, that she should think carefully about what she was starting. She didn't stop walking. She had already thought carefully. She had been thinking carefully for 3 weeks from the bottom of a river. Carol's car was idling at the curb. Laura put the kids in the back seat and got in the front, and Carol pulled away from the house without a word. At the end of the block, Carol asked where they were headed. Laura said the Williamson County Sheriff's Office. Carol nodded like that was exactly what she had expected to hear and took the on-ramp toward Franklin. The Williamson County Sheriff's Office that afternoon was fluorescent lights and the smell of burnt coffee, and a deputy at the front desk who looked up from his computer and then looked up again when he realized who was standing in front of him. Laura said her name. She said she was aware of what the official record said and that she needed to speak with an investigator. The deputy picked up his phone. Martin Pace walked through the door 40 minutes later, small, bald, with the kind of eyes that were always reading the room for angles. Carol had called him before they left the apartment 3 days earlier. He set his briefcase on a chair in the hallway, shook Laura's hand once, and said they had a lot to get through. He was not warm about it. She didn't need him to be warm. Laura gave her statement to a criminal investigator for 2.5 hours. She said everything in order, the same way she had told Ruth, the same way she had told Carol. But this time it was on record and a camera was running, and Martin Pace sat beside her and occasionally put a hand on the table to slow her down. The children waited in a separate room with a licensed family advocate the department had called in. Brooke had asked to stay with her mother and been told she could wait just outside the door. 2 days later, a dive team brought the car up from the Duck River. The forensic examiner's report came back inside 72 hours. The brake line had been compromised at a specific junction point, not cut but partially severed and refitted. The kind of modification designed to hold under normal pressure and fail progressively under sustained use. It was precise work. The examiner noted in her report that whoever had done it understood vehicle systems at a professional level. There was a partial fingerprint on the compression fitting. It matched Derek. He was arrested at the Mercer Development offices on a Tuesday morning. Carol heard from someone who had been in the building that he didn't argue or resist. He just stood there while they put the handcuffs on in front of the staff who had worked alongside him since the company's early days. With an expression that people described differently depending on who you asked. Shannon was picked up 2 hours later at the Brentwood house, 2 suitcases already in the back of her car. Kayla Simmons cooperated fully. She had retained her own attorney the day after Carol first made contact with her, and her testimony was detailed and consistent. Shannon had approached her about the notary records, had paid her in cash, and had told her it was only about understanding the financial picture before a potential divorce. Kayla said she hadn't known what would follow. The prosecutor declined to press for the maximum charge. She received a suspended sentence and 200 hours of community service. The trial ran 4 months later in the Williamson County Courthouse in Franklin. Laura sat in the front row with Tyler and Brooke on one side and Ruth Calvert on the other. Marge Hensley came down from Maury County and found Laura in the hallway before the proceedings started. And they held on to each other for a moment, the way people do when they have shared something that cannot be fully explained to anyone who wasn't there. Derek sat at the defense table in a jacket that no longer fit him quite right. He had lost weight. His attorney was good. Laura had expected that, but the fingerprint and Kayla's testimony and Carol's recordings had built something that good lawyering could work around the edges of but couldn't dismantle. Shannon sat at a separate table and did not look toward the gallery once. The verdicts came on the 3rd day. Derek guilty on 3 counts: attempted murder, insurance fraud, and falsification of medical records in connection with Tyler's fraudulent psychiatric intake. 13 years. Shannon guilty on conspiracy charges. 7 years. Kayla suspended sentence, community service, no prison time. Laura did not feel what she had expected to feel when the judge read the numbers. There was no particular satisfaction in it. 13 years was a door closing on a room she had already left. What she felt mostly was tired, the specific tiredness of someone who has been paying attention at full intensity for 4 months and has just been told she can stop. Jim Calloway found her on the courthouse steps afterward. He told her the company was intact, every transaction Derek had attempted was blocked, every account preserved, everything exactly as it had been the day she drove to that notary appointment in October. He said whatever she decided to do with her share, he would help her carry it out. She thanked him and meant it. That evening the 4 of them drove out to Hohenwald. Ruth had a pot of soup on the stove and the wood stove going. And the kitchen smelled the way Laura remembered it smelling when she was a child, and the world outside didn't feel entirely safe, and this was the place you came to anyway. Tyler ate a full bowl and then a second one, which was the best thing Laura had seen in months. Then he looked up with the expression he got when he was about to say something he knew was slightly ridiculous, and asked entirely seriously whether the new house could have a pool. Ruth said a pool with a tone suggesting this was the most self-indulgent thing she had heard in her 60-some years on Earth. Brooke said she thought they had earned a pool. Laura looked out the window at the frost settling over the fields and thought about the Duck River and what she had carried up from it. Not just herself. The will she had filed in secret. The email account from a childhood game. 3 weeks of staying invisible while the evidence assembled itself. You don't always know when you are being careful what exactly you are being careful for. Sometimes you are building something you won't need for months. Sometimes the thing you built without knowing you needed it is the only reason you are sitting at a table instead of at the bottom of a river. Survival doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just looks like a woman at her aunt's kitchen table, watching her kids argue about a pool on the first cold night of the year. If you had been in Laura's position, no phone, no documents, no witnesses, a husband with connections and a story already prepared, would you have gone straight to the police? Or would you have played it the way she did? There's no wrong answer. But I would genuinely like to know what you think.